I want to just set some context for this panel, and this is a really busy slide, and I'm not expecting you to read it, but I'm going to tell you what it means in a second. And what I want to cue on the panel, first of all, is I'm head of Modern Miracle Network, and we started in 2015 to create a reasoned conversation on energy. And I'll say at this conference in 2015, we were between, there's not a problem, we don't need to do anything, or can we out-liberal the liberals on taxes? And elect us because we'll make sure a carbon tax is revenue neutral was the argument. That was the only two arguments we had. And as I listened to every keynote speaker and almost most of the panels, there's been a really serious conversation about energy policy, whether it's to do with competitiveness or foreign policy or whatever, but it's all around that conservatives actually do have some ideas on the environment now, on energy policy, environment, security, et cetera. So there's been I'm just so thrilled about that. This panel, I think, is taking that to an interesting level. It's a representation of convergence. We've got former heads and current heads of environmental groups. We've got government, we've got private sector, and I think there is a convergence happening now that will become clearer and clearer between people who actually want to find real solutions for both the environment and for people, affordable energy that's cleaner. So I'm going to start off, part of that context is my slide is there. So I want to just make the point, and this comes from my private company. It's from a full cycle environmental study of a proposal, which we've now got proposals in Quebec, Alberta, and Utah on ideas of zero emissions energy hubs, which is an idea we got out of Norway. And we'll talk for a minute, like why is it going better in Utah than the other places. But I want to point out there's 18 different environmental factors. Only one of them is climate. And so I don't think that we need to argue about parts per million. There's going to be 10 billion people on the planet shortly. There's going to be more environmental pressures. And if you agree that it's better you're concerned about human health and our ecosystem generally, then you should be concerned about this issue, even if you don't care about how many parts per million, although I think a lot of us care about that too. So that's a context for the conversation. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let the panel members give a short introduction on why they think this issue is important. I'm going to start off and introduce Ed Whittingham. Ed, I first met Ed on Twitter. He's former head of the Pembina Institute. For people who know me or follow my Twitter feed, you may be unsurprised to learn that Ed and I disagreed on Twitter when we first met. But I have to tell you, we have converged and are now agreeing a lot. He's currently a public, he was named one of Alberta's 50 most influential people by Alberta Venture magazine. I'm not sure how I got missed out there. Ed is a public policy professional now, so he's actually advising clients on how to create private market solutions to some of these global environmental problems, climate change, industrial decarbonization, et cetera. As I said, he's former executive director of the Pembina Institute. I'll maybe just introduce everybody and then I'll let you guys go in. So Eric Duhem, I actually met Eric Duhem, I got to be, I don't want to embarrass either as far some recent number of years ago. He came to Civitas in Calgary and he stood up from Quebec and said, "Why do you guys keep sending us money? Please stop." Right? And I thought to myself, well, what a great idea. And why didn't we think of it, right? Anyways, he started with the ADQ. He's had early career in politics. Was his chief of staff, I think, for the leader of the opposition. He went on to be a really popular talk show radio host. His partner makes the most amazing clothes that my wife wears. This is the thing we most like about him. He also started the Réseau Liberté. It's a libertarian group in Quebec. I went to one of their first conferences, 1,000 people in Montreal. You can't get 1,000 libertarians to a conference in Alberta. Like, incredible that they did that. And now, of course, he's gone on to become now the leader of the Conservative Party of Quebec, which went from 1% to 13% or something like that in just one election. We also have Clint Thomas. Clint Thomas is quintessential private sector guy. He's also represents Bruce Power, which has been very persistent on as a private nuclear business. I also want to really thank them. As this conference has gone through ups and downs, Bruce Power has always supported us, and I think a perfect person to be up here to talk about private market solutions to public problems. And he's manager of government relations there. He's worked with the Ontario government, and he's also been an award-winning journalist. So a varied background. And then we have one of my favorite, I can't say my favorite because there's others here, but one of my favorite MPs from Alberta, Shannon Stubbs, who represents Lakeland, Alberta. She's won the Maclean's Parliamentarian of the Year Award for who best represents her constituents. I think constituency work gets underestimated, and I think MPs who do it are this is fundamental to representative democracy, so congratulations on that. Currently the Shadow Minister for Natural Resources, so very germane to this topic. I also want to point out that she worked with the Quebec Oil and Gas Association, which I'm the chair of and was at the time, as well as the CAODC drilling contractors, submitted the biggest e-petition ever, at least at that time, to Parliament. So familiar with activism and really diverse professional background, all the way from oil sands business unit to Hill and Knowlton Communications. So with that, I'm going to just turn this over to Ed for a couple minutes. Just say, where you're from, where you come from on this idea of private market solutions.
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and thanks for being the catalyst for me returning to the Canada Strong and Free Network Conference. As I told Preston last night, I was last here in 2009. So that interval is kind of comparable to Jean Charest's absence from federal politics. Right. The only difference being my return to the conference was successful. So I am gratuitously pandering to the crowd, as you can see. So yeah, I work in public policy. I work with a lot of clients, companies, clean tech companies, industry associations, even those environmental NGOs, all trying to help Canada to decarbonize its economy. And I was very interested to hear the leader yesterday say that he wants to tackle the problem of climate change through technology, not taxes. And I get that. I want to tackle it personally through technology, and there's a role for conservation as well. I will note that the word conservative and conservation, they share a similar root. But I'm kind of agnostic as to how we get there, whether we get there through big regulatory sticks or whether we get there through market-based approaches. I think it's likely going to be a mixture of the two. The reality in Canada right now is that we've got a mixture of the two, but it's not yet working. And by that I mean we're not seeing the big capital moving into industrial decarbonization. I work with companies that are trying to develop carbon capture and storage projects. And right now, the conundrum they face is that in order to make billion-dollar investments to decarbonize, say, a cement plant or a steel mill, then you need to look ahead and you need to see that this commodity that I produce, and the commodity being CO2, if you're using carbon capture, it's a whole separate plant, it's not just bolt-on technology. This commodity I produce, no one wants. And moreover, I have to pay to get someone to take it away and to inject it underground, which is what we want to do. So I rely on some type of market system to put some value. Otherwise, I can't do this out of the goodness of my heart. The corporate leadership will only go so far. At some point, you actually need to say, well, this makes sense. And by the way, a lot of those companies, some are headquartered in Canada, some are headquartered outside of Canada, and they're looking at the best return on their industrial decarbonization dollar. And the reality right now is, in the United States, you're seeing a more attractive policy and regulatory environment for that industrial decarbonization dollar. That's where the capital is flowing now. We'll see what happens on Tuesday, because we've got that federal budget that will come out. Minister Freeland has said one of her intentions to try to keep pace with what's happening in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is essentially, a label for what is industrial strategy. But if we don't keep pace, and if we don't get that mixture right, then unfortunately we're just going to continue to see capital flowing to where it makes sense. And I want Canada to participate in the jobs benefit, the economy benefits, the know-how benefit, especially in the province where I come from, Alberta. I don't want us to get left behind. So we have to come up with a better mixture of regulatory and market-based incentives for that to happen.
Excellent. Eric.
Well, I'm here not to talk necessarily just about market solutions. I'm here to talk to you about also why the intervention could be worse, much worse than any kind of private initiative in terms of energy. Michael started by saying that he met me many years ago in Alberta because I was talking against transfer payments and equalization, and I still believe that it's a bad idea, and I think it's a bad policy that is and you know, people are saying Quebec is benefiting from it. We're not benefiting from it in the long run. You know, when you're getting a welfare check instead of working and developing your own industry, you're not helping anyone. And the only thing that the equalization payment is doing right now is sending the wrong signal, which means we're punishing those who are developing their industry and providing energy for all Canadians and even people abroad. And on the other hand, we're subsidizing those who have energy under their feet and refuse to drill. And it has nothing to do with the environment. And that being said, you know, Quebec, we've been proud historically because we thought we have hydroelectricity and the West had oil and gas. That's the way we saw the natural resources in Canada historically. Well, because we gave the control of the industry to the government in Quebec with a public monopoly called Hydro-Quebec, well, unlike the West where it was developed by private initiative, it's been a fiasco in Quebec right now. We thought we had huge surpluses. 2 years ago, we sold 20% of our production to the US at a very, very low price because we thought we're producing way too much energy. And now we're told by our government that they're running out of electricity. You know, it's traditional. We all know that. Margaret Thatcher used to say, you give the Sahara to a government and they're going to run out of sand. Well, we gave the electricity business to our government and now they're running out of electricity. Last week, our economic minister, Pierre Fitzgibbon, announced that you know, Volkswagen, who wanted to open up a new plant in Quebec, will not be able, and he told them to go to Ontario because we can't provide the energy that they need for their new plant to get established in Quebec. We're told by the government, and there's all sorts of contradiction coming out from the public offices right now. We're told that in 10 years we won't be able to sell cars that are not electrical. So it's 100%. They want to eliminate completely gas, oil and gas. They also adopted lately a policy, even if they promised, the same government, 5 years ago, our Premier, Mr. Legault, promised that he will develop our oil and gas industry in Quebec. He even said that he wanted Quebec to become the Norway of America. Well, last year, he adopted a bill to forbid any kind of exploitation of our oil and gas on Quebec's territory. Why? Because he decided to listen to a few environmental elites instead of listening to voters. And now we're running out of electricity. They want to transform everything. They want us to stop heating our houses with gas, and they're subsidizing it so we go to electricity. But at the same time, the minister says we have to be sober in terms of energy, and I'm not joking here. He used China as an example. He said that when he lived in China, people would put down the heating in their house to 17 degrees, and we should do the same. He said that we need to start our dryer machines after midnight to make sure there's no peak during the winter time. So this is the kind of speech that we're getting from public officers, and it makes just no sense, and it's full of contradiction. So on one hand, we have tons of energy, we're selling it for a very good price to the US. On the other hand, we're told that we have to be sober, and on the other hand, we're saying that we need to kill the oil and gas industry. Don't try to find any kind of sense. There's no sense out there. And at the same time, they killed a $14 billion project up north in Quebec, the LNG project, liquefied natural gas, Quebec, that would have helped actually, because we could have sent gas to, for example, to Germany right now, so they don't use coal, 60% less emission. Yes, it would have been more emission in Canada, but globally it would have been much better for the Earth. So I know, Michael, that I'm limited in time, but I'm going to talk more about it. But what I wanted to say globally is that we need to stop thinking that the government knows best, and we cannot give them the monopoly to, have our energy policies at heart. They don't. We need private sector initiatives because the government is a bad provider of resources.
Actually, as far as time goes, we have 30 minutes, and if you want to take the entire 30 minutes and talk about why Quebec should produce its gas, that would be fine. But if you don't want to, I'm going to pass it to Clint and talk about, when we talk about all solutions on the table, let's talk about your private market solutions.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. It's only the second time I've actually ever been able to attend this conference, and certainly the first time I've been able to speak at it. So thank you very much for having me and allowing me to share a little bit of perspective from Bruce Power. We are the world's largest nuclear operating site. We have 8 reactors. And when I started this job almost 3 years ago, it has been astonishing to me how much public opinion has changed on nuclear and its role in moving forward in decarbonization around the world. A lot of that is based on science, which has congealed around the idea that to get to this net zero concept, everybody I think hears the net zero term thrown around a lot. In order to reach that objective, you need nuclear power. You need it because it provides energy with a smaller footprint than any other source that you have. And it provides it in large quantity, and it's reliable, and it's clean. That's the thing, it's zero emissions. So, and I think conservatives for a long time have understood the value proposition of nuclear energy, especially when it comes to job creation and economic impact. For example, our refurbishment program going on right now, we employ directly, indirectly 22,000 people, contribute $4 billion to Ontario's GDP. It's about 8 to 11 billion for Canada. And our supply chain is based over 90% in Canada, most of that in Ontario, but it's spread across Ontario. There's suppliers all across this province. You have Nordion, which processes our Cobalt-60 just up the road here. And the proposition that nuclear brings is unparalleled. And just to set the stage as to our structure, Bruce Power was formed in 2001. We have, and that was under former Premier Harris's leadership. I actually had the opportunity to tour him through the plant last summer with Mike Jr., who's an MPP in Ontario now, and that was a real highlight of my career so far at Bruce Power. So now we have a structure where we have TC and OMERS, who are 48% each ownership share, and our unions, Power Workers Union and Society of United Professionals, makes up the rest, basically. So our workers have an ownership stake in that as well, and that structure has worked very well. I would argue that we're one of the most successful P3s in Canada. Here we are 20 years later, and TC and OMERS still see us as a valuable investment. And we talk about free market energy solutions, Michael. We just issued a news release a little over an hour ago announcing that we issued our second green bond worth $600 million. So, and from what I understand, it was several times oversubscribed, as our first one was back in 2021. So I think the market is speaking clearly as to how it sees nuclear and Bruce Power as a solution going forward.
And I got a great place for you to invest some of that money, by the way. Okay, Shannon, you're right there in the Parliament. Like, tell us, what you think about why private market solutions aren't going forward.
Do you have all day?
26 minutes.
So no.
And we got to get back to these gas wells.
Yeah, definitely. Michael, I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel, and it really is a pleasure to sit up here with such esteemed other panelists. I hope to listen to them even a lot more than I talk. I'm going to do this one thing that I feel I'm bound, I must do. I noticed Candace Bergen in the audience.
Oh, great.
And I do this at the risk of not recognizing any other Conservative MPs or former MPs who might be in here, so I apologize in advance. But Candace, as you know, played an important role as interim leader during a challenging time for us, leaves a real strong legacy to the party and the country, and is a champion of resource development. So I just want to acknowledge that she's here. Well, I'm interested in this topic because I think it is the only solution. I guess just to frame the context for these comments, it's my belief that this intersection of energy and environment policy is the most consequential public policy discussion to the Canadian economy, period. But I've long believed, and I have some hope that this will become more of a part of the regular public discourse around energy and the environment. I hope that people are starting to realize that it's also the most consequential economic and security question for the free world and for any and all citizens who want free and democratic countries where they can live, work hard, pursue their dreams. The attack on Ukraine, the global cost of living crisis, the global energy crisis, this should put into stark relief how important getting energy and environment policy is to ensuring that traditional sources of energy development can continue to thrive, because those are exactly the investors and the scientists and the entrepreneurs who, if they are just allowed, can lead the frontier of new innovative technologies and the energy and electricity sources of the future. Unfortunately, I would say after 8 years of this government, what you've seen is just the pancaking of red tape, regulations, and costs, coupled with sometimes inconsistent and contradictory, but overall hostile messages about energy development. And for all the rhetoric about inclusivity, they are extremely exclusionary in their policy framework toward energy. They're all about governments picking winners and losers, but it's divorced. It's completely divorced from the public policy aspirations that they say they believe in, and it's completely divorced, at least for our country, in terms of questions about feasibility, affordability, accessibility, availability of the diverse range of energy sources across the country and in the territories for people's real lives. This government policy is totally divorced from all of that. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but just to link this to the issue of energy security and sovereignty, the point about the EV plan, I think that major issue that Canadian public policy developers and politicians have to really contemplate here is, what if you only focus on the end goal of that plan? Where is the supply chain and the value chain right now, and in a reasonable timeline to make that happen? Well, the truth is, right now, it's not going to be news to anyone, that's China. Right? That public policy right now would just encourage China with child slave labor and environmental devastation, because they're the world's leading producers on the components required to get to that end. So I think this is why you're seeing our leader talk more and more obviously about all and any energy solutions that are required for environmental stewardship and to reduce emissions overall, and with a focus on the Canadian government seems to have this approach where they want to punish the best in class, which is Canada. Instead, we should be crediting Canada, getting Canadian products and technology out to the world to lower global emissions, set the facts straight on our track record and all the opportunities in the future, if only the government would get out of the way.
I have a specific question just on that. And I'll just say that Modern Miracle Network commissioned a study from Navius. Navius Research, by the way, out of Vancouver, hired by the NDP, and Alberta, hired by the Gerald Butts AstroTurf organization, Ecofiscal, to do their work. So not a conservative group at all. And I asked them to study aluminum, and it turns out Canadian aluminum generates 2 tons of CO2 for every ton of aluminum. America is like 10. China is who knows how much. Australia is like 11 or 12. So that's one thing. So every ton of aluminum Canada produces more, and America less, for example. 2 more tons of CO2 here, 10 less tons there, 16 less tons in China, right? So the other thing, just how I got interested in this, because I published the very first paper by a pseudo self-taught economist on carbon leakage and policy options, because not a single Canadian economist had ever published one before. And it was because, and how I got interested was because in Quebec, I said, if we produce gas locally instead of importing it from Pennsylvania or from Alberta, emissions will go down in Alberta, they'll go up in Quebec, but net Canadian emissions go down. And environmentalists in Quebec said, so what? We only care about Quebec emissions. So my question then, just on this question about not promoting best in class, if we really care about a global problem, shouldn't we be doing everything we can to produce as much aluminum as we can, or as much LNG as we can, or as much of any product that in Canada can be produced with a comparative advantage in carbon, less embedded emissions? And I'll just go on to say, because of hydro and nuclear, we have one of the lowest emissions in electrical systems in the world. Almost everything produced in Canada has less embedded emissions. So to your point, and I'm going to go to Eric because this is where I first ran into this problem, why are governments saying, let's suppress production of some of the lowest emissions products in the world in favor, did you turn your phone off, everybody?
We did.
Yeah. We did.
We remember to, Michael.
Because I'm going to, and I think you should too. Okay, Eric.
Well, it's interesting that you raised that issue, Michael, because it was at the center of the last election in Quebec, because all the party were in a fight to know which one was proposing the highest percentage of gas emission reduction. And it was a huge challenge. That was the race for them, like 50% and 60%. They went over the roof. I said, why not to 120%? Because their plan was to export emissions. It was not to eliminate emissions. It was to export them. So we'll stop produce whatever it needs to do to make sure they reach their targets, and then we're going to import everything. So we have a great, we have a great record, so we can show off the world. Look, we're the best because we have no emission, because we import everything that needs to be produced with emissions. So it was very hypocritical, and I think as conservatives, we need to do something. We need to make sure that when we present our percentage of gas emission in the future, we need to show what's the impact globally. Stop thinking just, the environment has no borders, and we have to stop thinking of just within our province or our country or even our continent. We need to look globally, what's the impact. And we shouldn't calculate actually even just on our territory. That's a huge problem that right now we're facing politically.
So Ed, I first ran into this problem with NGOs in Quebec, and they said, and they told me, no, you don't get it. We completely understand. We understand your project is a major reduction of Canadian emissions. We get it, but we don't care. So tell me why, and I know that wasn't Pembina that said that, but it was people in the NGO community. Help me understand.
Well, I won't speak for Quebec-based NGOs. And frankly, I don't know that much about drilling for oil or drilling for gas in Quebec. I live in Alberta, where I understand it better. They're their own politics, but you have to look at trade-offs as well. So you could say emissions, but then, frankly, and I think Albertans are a lot more socialized to, say, an acid gas pipeline running across, their land than, say, someone in Quebec is. Just like people in Ontario are a lot more accustomed to having gigawatt-scale nuclear power than, say, someone in Alberta or someone in British Columbia is. So this is, if we do have to listen to the people and what they want in their backyards. What I'm all about is having frank, honest conversations about the trade-offs. And I'll be the first one to say, hey, I live in Alberta. We have an acid gas pipeline running across a backyard. We have been taking gases out of the earth from the subsurface for over a century now, dating back to the early 1800s. We've been re-injecting gases back into the subsurface, and new build pipe tends not to rupture. It's very safe. And I'd say the same with nuclear. I could make an argument for building gigawatt-scale nuclear as part of decarbonizing our electricity system, maybe in Canada, but worldwide, I think. And if it's a choice between coal and new nuclear, I'd take new nuclear every day, all day. But we also have to respect the people who are living next to energy infrastructure and their decisions. And when we don't respect that, when we try to foist decisions on people that they don't want, and we don't set up the right consultation processes or the right fora, then as Canadians we tend to get into trouble. And the one thing that we miss as Canadians right now is we don't have any kind of overarching energy strategy. And Preston Manning will say the last cabinet minister to use national energy strategy and talk about something which is just a commonly held vision for how we're going to develop and manage our energy resources was C.D. Howe. C.D. Howe was a long time ago. So I think that's part of it. We're still missing that overarching strategy that says, as Canadians, you can run it through a national commission or whatever, as Canadians, this is what we want, here are the trade-offs, and then here's the trade-offs that we're prepared to accept. And I still think in this country we're not having any kind of honest conversation about that.
Okay, so
But can I
Okay,
touch
yeah.
on the honest conversation aspect? Yeah, so I think I agree with you for a whole host of reasons and on a whole host of issues. But I'll give an example of where I'm concerned about local voices potentially being overruled, and it's Indigenous communities who in Lakeland and across Alberta and across the country, but of course because of Alberta's widespread and long-term historical energy development, lots of more years of experience in that regard. Almost all of them in some way or another have been and long were involved in energy development. I represent a number of communities who covered all their own source revenue from their primary production oil and gas companies and from their various contracting companies. They are the biggest contract service and supply providers in the region. So here's an example of the kinds of things that happened. All of those communities, as well as communities in British Columbia, they had mutual benefit agreements on the Northern Gateway pipeline. They had mutual benefit agreements on the TMX pipeline. The ability of their primary production work obviously is contingent on the capacity for them to be able to ship it. And so you see well-funded, multi-pronged anti-energy activism, I would note, being driven from all kinds of places other than the place where this development is actually happening. And this government, which will simultaneously say the relationship with Indigenous people is the number one priority to them, and certainly it must be a priority to all Canadians and for the public policy framework in Canada. But they now, with their changes to the regulatory system and removing any parameters around interveners in the process, as you know previously, when Canada's regulatory system, I must say this, did rank as second to none. Also before the Liberals' changes, that's not a Conservative saying that, Worley Parsons said that twice under the previous Harper government on literally every aspect: science, evidence-based decision-making, transparency, reporting, inclusion of Indigenous traditional knowledge, the whole gamut. Canada's regulatory system was well-renowned globally for being second to none. But what the Liberals did then was, of course, instead of taking the option of in the judgment for Northern Gateway for the Crown, because that's where the failure was, to redo their Indigenous consultation. The Prime Minister didn't take that option. He outright vetoed it in an OIC. Fast forward it on the TMX pipeline, the court ruled the identical thing. And they took the option to redo their Indigenous consultation, and then the pipeline was approved. Of course, since then they wouldn't give the legal and political certainty for the private sector proponent to go ahead and build their initiative. They bought it, and that's been just a boondoggle. But with the changes to the regulatory system now, it is no longer interveners who either are locally impacted or have a specific set of expertise or knowledge to participate in the process. They've opened the doors wide now. Literally anybody can submit into interventions in the regulatory system. So what's really happening is that local Indigenous communities and all kinds of communities who have vested interest in seeing these projects go ahead, the current regulatory changes of the Liberal government puts all of that at risk from external activism.
I think that's sort of an irony
activism.
that all some of these systems that we put in place for consultations to protect Indigenous people are actually giving them gave them the power to say no, but now that they want to say yes, they have no power to say yes, and I think that's a problem here. But it leads to, because we have 10 minutes left, just sort of a comparison of where we are compared to the United States, for example, and it leads into this, like, if if, for example, using nuclear electricity, we can, it's hard to export the electricity to China, but you can definitely export a product made with that electricity with very low embedded emissions to China. So it's a way of, exporting the low emissions energy inside a product. So, and I guess my question, Canada's not seeming to want to do that. I guess I would say, why are new technologies around exporting with low emissions energy, or some of the new carbon recycling technologies? I'll take CO2. I'm not sure if the audience knows this, but you can make anything out of CO2. Industrial alcohols, calcium carbonate. There's a company in New York that makes the world's purest vodka out of CO2. It's called Airco. Like you could, it's, and they do it just to demonstrate what you can do with the recycling of CO2. My daughter says, well, if that's all possible, and it's been possible for a long time, how come we don't do it? So I'll say my answer. I'm interested in your answer. Why are these technologies going forward in the United States? Why are we at risk of, all of the high-tech carbon recycling, high-tech carbon tech jobs going to the United States instead of Canada? And I know, Ed, you have a lot of thoughts on the regulatory, so I'll let you start with that, and then we'll see if you guys we'll finish with you, Shannon.
Sure, yeah, I guess it's coming back to what I said earlier about the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which as a name is a great misnomer, because it really is industrial strategy and redoing industrial strategy. And the U.S. has made a bet through that act and through the $370 billion in incentives that are included within the act on where the puck is going. So they're all in on clean energy transition. That's what they said. The puck's going there, and U.S. presidents, typically they don't go to these big annual climate conferences saying, well, I'm going to tax carbon. What they say is, I'm going to spend my way to get to an emissions reduction pledge, which they've made a very significant emissions reductions pledge. And Congress and I have this power. We're going to spend our way to get there. So heavy on the carrots, lighter on the sticks. Now the U.S. economy, I'm not trying to compare it to the Canadian economy. Theirs is a massive open economy, ours is a small open economy. And they've got the national, basically, Treasury Reserve, or the International Treasury Reserve in the American greenback. But what they've done is spent very generously something on hydrogen, on carbon capture and storage. If you're trying to if you're producing low-carbon hydrogen, you get a tax credit. If you're building a carbon capture plant, you get a tax credit. If you're producing low-carbon renewable electricity, you get a tax credit. If you're packaging that all up, you get a tax credit. It's like Oprah Winfrey saying tax credits for everyone. So that's what they've done. But most importantly, number one piece of importance out of that is it has bipartisan support. So if you're a company and you're making investments that have a 20 to 30-year horizon, you look and say, it has bipartisan support. In Canada, we don't have that bipartisan support. So frankly, the companies I deal with who want to make big investments, they look at what the leader said last night, and they're spooked by it. Because they think, okay, well, he might take away the pricing system we have, the only system we have for putting a price on this commodity we produce that no one wants. So until we create some kind of certainty, some bipartisan certainty on our regulatory approach, then unfortunately, as I say, I'm worried about that money drifting down to the United States and all the jobs and GDP growth benefits that come with it.
Well,
Quebec wants to export their emissions instead of create low emissions stuff in Quebec. So why aren't they doing what America's doing?
Well, I'm going to come back again to the political incentives versus the private sector incentives. And let's use the nuclear example, because in Quebec we used to have a huge plant south of Trois-Rivières in Gentilly that was shut down because, of course, nuclear energy was scary, and a lot of people, all of the things that happened in the past, and without taking into account the new technologies. Now I see that France and Ontario are moving that way, but in Quebec, even if politically, and I know at high levels right now in the Quebec government, they understand and they know that the nuclear energy could be part of the solution with the diversity of sources of energy. They're not going to go that way. because politically they don't want to defend it. And if it was a private sector initiative, it wouldn't be a public relations thing that matters. It would be the results and the risk that the investors are taking. And that's not what the government's doing, because the government wants to save its face in the papers tomorrow. They don't care about how much it's going to cost, because they don't have the investors that are pushing them, and they don't have the clients that are screaming when they're not delivering what they're looking for. And that's the difference between when it's politically driven and when it's done by the private sector. And it's a good example, I think, to see the difference and that's why we have, I think, bad solutions in Canada, because it's too centrally planned and decided by bureaucrats and politicians who have no interest and who are not taking the risk for the decisions they're making.
So how does this relate to nuclear, U.S. compared to Canada? To see that?
So U.S. Inflation Reduction Act is a concern for us, obviously, and we're eager to see how the federal government responds in the budget on Tuesday. They had pledged to consult on including large nuclear and hydro in the proposed investment tax credit, and we're hopeful that they understand that this is a competitive issue for us here as an industry, because our supply chain partners can easily, move across borders and go where there's a better deal for them. So that's something that we are hopeful that is going to take place on Tuesday when the budget comes down. You saw the Ontario government this week announce a manufacturing investment tax credit that's in partial response to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. And I'll just point out, the last time we had this kind of competitive threat from the United States was 2018, when they introduced the accelerated capital cost allowance. You might remember that. And both the federal and provincial governments, I was there at the time, responded with measures in kind. So hoping that the federal government will do likewise on Tuesday. Something back to your point, Michael, about exporting things made with clean emissions. I think that's part of the thinking behind the Clean Energy Credit Registry, which the Ontario government announced in its budget yesterday, and which we will be happy to play a role in. We have, as part of our refurbishment program, something we call Project 2030, which aims to use innovation and efficiencies to increase the output of our reactors on site. And we started in 2016 with 6,300 megawatt capacity. We are expecting to get up to, we're at 6,550 now, we're expecting to get up to 7,000 by 2030, and our CEO likes to say that he thinks we can go even beyond that. So that, to put it in perspective, is basically adding the capacity of an entire large CANDU reactor, and like a ninth reactor, to our site without doing any infrastructure build or any, it's basically just through innovation and efficiency. So you're not going to get cleaner or more affordable power than that. Mm-hmm. We definitely have a role to play there, and I think the IESO pathway to decarbonization report that came out before Christmas talked about what we need to do to reach those decarbonization goals, net zero by 2050. You're looking at 60,000 megawatts of new clean electricity. Breaks down about a third nuclear, a third renewables, a third hydrogen, and then others, hydro biomass, are sprinkled in there as well. That's a massive lift. Like, that's a huge lift for Ontario and our country, quite frankly. So, in order to do that, there's a lot of discussion going on right now, a lot of engagement that needs to happen, and the regulatory process, quite frankly, needs to recognize this, and we need to be quicker and more nimble on that front.
Okay, so Shannon, just to finish off this, actually, just before I go, just at the back of the house there, I saw 10 minutes got added to this clock. Is that because our next speaker is late, or is that just a glitch? Can somebody give me a clue on that? Running late? Okay, so we're gonna keep entertaining you until our next speaker comes. Because we have been extraordinarily entertaining. You probably didn't want to listen to Conrad Black anyways, right?
Yeah, I don't know how entertaining we have been.
Yeah, so take your time answering this. But actually, I have a whole other question I want to ask, so this is perfect. So, but Shannon, like Canada, I mean, we're going to have a retail carbon tax, and that's going to eliminate the regulations, but then it was like, well, actually, it's not working, so we need more regulations. Well, that's actually not working, so now we need a clean fuel bill. It's going to actually put a big emitter, $170 a ton new carbon tax on, and then, well, that's not working, so we need methane reduction. Well, that's not working. So we keep building up this, layer upon layer upon layer, and what I worry about in the budget, we're going to get another layer or another Band-Aid onto a set of whole policies that they hope will fix it, but will actually just continue to make it worse. Whereas down in the United States, as Ed's describing, if I eliminate a ton of carbon, I get a credit.
Yes.
Well, that
exactly.
seems pretty simple, and by the way, I'm guaranteed it for 12 years, right?
Right.
So tell me from your perspective sitting there, what do you think? Do you think we're just going to get another Band-Aid, or do you think we're going to see some progress to say we have to compete with the United States?
Well, far be it for me to predict what they will do, but they give contradictory messages, right? And so that is why it is hard to predict. The Deputy Prime Minister, of course, a little while ago was talking about how the acceleration of project approvals, I think she was mainly referencing critical minerals, needs to happen in order for us to provide for ourselves and also to be able to provide for our allies. I just find it a little bit wild that 8 years into a government, the Deputy Prime Minister says that this needs to happen when they've just spent 8 years doing everything they can to make the processes cumbersome and the timelines longer. In the regulatory process, they will tell you it takes 30 months. That's not true, because also embedded in the legislation is the ability for any cabinet minister and any commissioner to start and stop the process, the assessment process, with no finite timeline at any time. So this, I think, is part of our problem. It goes to your point about not really having an energy strategy, or at least those messages coming from the leadership of our country about our own track record and about the role that Canada can play in the world. The IRA competitiveness issue is, I think, devastating for Canada in terms of both our traditional sources of energy, but trying to lead the new wave of energy and environmental technologies. I've heard a couple of stories recently from a pulp company that had a deal with a First Nations community to take forest waste, and that deal all fell apart. It's going to a different country. There's and a hydrogen company that had a deal to take forest waste, create hydrogen from it. They're going south. Biodiesel refinery in BC just recently canceled. They're going south. And the answers are always timelines in Canada, and market certainty, but also because in the United States, their programs are all incentives, they're technology neutral, they also have incentives for production, and so it's more attractive, and they want to put their multi-millions of dollars in Canada, they want to invest here, they want to build here, and it's really the regulatory and fiscal conditions domestically that have made them determine that they can't compete, so therefore there's no business case. And I just want to say a point on this business case issue, Michael, again about honest conversations. I wish that, I understand the position that private sector proponents are in dealing in a very highly regulated industry and they must deal with the governments that are in place. But I noticed that politicians will capitalize on a private sector proponent being diplomatic and saying that they've made a decision based on a business case. What I'm amazed at is the lack of challenge from resource developers or resource reporters or from other pundits or from thought leaders saying the business decisions that multi-million-dollar projects consider are precise in a highly regulated industry are precisely the fiscal and regulatory conditions in place by the government.
Self-fulfilling
That's
prophecy.
inextricable from the business case decisions.
I'm going
they
to
have
pretend
make.
you're the moderator right now and you just ask me a question.
Yeah. Do it. Yeah.
Because that report, you were talking about Repsol, right? Repsol said they're pulling out of Canada LNG, but first of all, it's been spun on in social media as because LNG is not economic, but that's not even what the media report said. The report was it's too expensive to get gas to New Brunswick. It's just so self-evident that if America can buy gas from Canada, move it all the way down to the Louisiana Gulf Coast, and then liquefy gas there and ship it all the way back up to Hamburg, which is it's about 50, almost twice as far, but let's call it 50% or more further from Louisiana to Hamburg than Quebec or New Brunswick to Hamburg. If that makes money for Americans, of course and Repsol never said the LNG part didn't make money. They said it's too expensive to get gas to New Brunswick. Well, why is it too expensive to get gas to New Brunswick? Because as TC Energy announced some months ago, the pipeline needs a major upgrade.
Yes.
Well, do you know of something that's really expensive to do in Canada? Pipelines, right? So, of course, they're saying it's too expensive to get gas to New Brunswick. What they're really saying is Canada can't move gas within the country, therefore it makes it hard to have an LNG project. Well, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy of government policy that made it too difficult and too expensive to build or enhance pipelines.
Yes.
So, and then he goes, oh, you see, it's not economic. Yeah, but you made it not economic.
Exactly. Yeah.
Michael, can I just use a quick example? I keep looking at the door. I'm waiting for the chorus of trumpets
We got
that will mark that
5:22.
Lord Black is here. So I'll keep looking, but I think we're good. So a practical case, so Carbon Engineering, which is actually a great Canadian clean tech startup and has done this amazing trick of figuring out technology to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Right.
And then once you've done that, you can use it. There are utilization cases, there are storage cases. You can make low carbon fuel out of it. It's a Canadian company that is building the world's first megaton scale commercialization plant in the United States in partnership with Occidental Petroleum, great oil and gas behemoth, in the Permian Basin in Texas, in the heart of oil and gas country. Why is it doing it in the United States and not here? And the answer is partly it's the Inflation Reduction Act, but just to show how you have a robust framework, it's also the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard market, which says if you build a direct air capture plant anywhere, you can sell credits into our market. Now that's less of a carrot, that's more of a stick. But then they also have the Department of Loans, the loans program at the US Department of Energy, which will actually take on technology risk. And that's saying, we're gonna provide you not low-cost capital, like market capital, cost of capital, but we're gonna take that risk because we see that bet worth making. So you take that, a good loans program, IRA supports, it pays you, in this case, $180 per ton that you sequester, $130 if you use it for enhanced oil recovery. The California market as well, where you can sell in your credits, the combination of that makes it feasible to get that project over the FID hurdle in partnership with a big oil and gas major that is transitioning itself into a carbon management company. So it's not just carrots, it's not just sticks. You can go a little more on one, a little more on the other. It's the combination. They've got it right. We're still trying to figure it out here in Canada.
Right. I want to add to that point because you meant, Paulie, have scared everybody. But I would say the uncertainty starts with this huge layer cake of regulations and mandates and taxes that just keeps growing and growing. That's where the uncertainty starts with. And by the way, no assurances that any of them last beyond the next parliamentary session.
There lies the problem.
But I would also say I heard when I heard and I've listened to Pierre and I've listened to what he's talked about in terms of policy. What I hear him talking about is we're going to go with an incentive-based system to encourage technology. Not that we're going to eliminate incentives or eliminate the possibility of some price on carbon somewhere. I think what he's saying is let's get rid of the penalties, retail sales taxes, but let's replace them with some sort of an incentive. That's what I hear him saying, but I still also get it. Like the existing system has no certainty to it, and then there could be a change of government on top of it. It's just uncertainty on top of uncertainties. So I'll maybe I'll just ask the panel, your thoughts on.
Can I just ask a question? Because Ed,
You be the moderator. Ask him a question.
No, but it's because you spoke about social acceptability a bit earlier on about the And that's another thing that is always used to increase the difficulties to do anything in Canada, especially the pipelines or LNG projects or anything. And that's something else that we need as conservatives to lead the way of what does it mean social acceptability. Because even when it's driven by the private sector, there's going to be social acceptability. There's not one single business that wants to piss off everybody where they're doing business.
Right.
And so they need social acceptability. But that buzzword has now been used by the socialists to say it's the people downtown Toronto and downtown Montreal that are going to decide what's happening in your Aboriginal reserve or in your region 700 kilometers away. And that's the problem with social acceptability now. It's the way they've been able to twist it. And it's not the people, I'm sorry, but when you're downtown Montreal and you're saying that we shouldn't invest $14 billion in the Saguenay region, 500 kilometers away from your home, I'm sorry, but you don't have a word to say in that business. It's the people that it's in their backyard that the pipeline's going to be that need to talk about it.
Yeah.
And when there's 70% of those people who are saying yes, you can't say there's no social acceptability.
Yeah, exactly.
And so,
Eric, I completely agree with that. And we've got this, and actually years ago with U of A professor Andre Plord, we wrote a paper to try to put some definition on that. And I'm very sympathetic to what Shannon's saying. I've spent time in rural Alberta, spent time amongst Indigenous communities. Like, it's a germane conversation right now around social acceptability to go to Athabasca Chippewa First Nation and talk to them right now, because these are the places that have the downsides when things go wrong. So I'm much more partial to listening to those concerns of the people who are next to the infrastructure, and then saying, hey, here are the protections we have, here what we can do, here are the how we can make amends when things go wrong. Much more sympathetic to that. And I think we still haven't we haven't hammered out a good review system to kind of, figure out how to give a little bit more preference to those voices.
Okay, well, I hate to do this because it felt like a debate's about to break out and it was getting interesting. But they didn't put another 10 minutes on the clock, so I have to wrap this up. So I'm going to wrap this up with one point. I remember Harper was vilified for things like trying to get a better review process for pipelines, but also on environmental policy, because he insisted we have to integrate with whatever the United States does. Well, I would say that it took the United States a long time to come up with what they've decided, but it's become very obvious that we're in trouble in this country if we don't figure out to do what Harper said we need to do, which is integrate with what America does, at least be harmonized in some way, right? And the risk to us, I think, is that as Canada, we look and say, we should do everything we can to reduce our 1.6% of world emissions, but there is 98.4% of world emissions out there that we could make a big difference to if we were to unleash private markets exporting more and more goods with clean nuclear power embedded in them, and also to have the right incentive systems that encouraged investment instead of penalizing people for driving to work and heating their homes, right? So I'm going to finish with that. Thank you to the panel.